Hello and welcome to Take Me Home, the podcast offering a social democratic alternative for the politically homeless. My name is Sebastian Moore.
And I'm Hilary Salt.
And we are joined today by a very, very special guest, the chair of the Social Democratic Party, Stephen Balogh.
Hello, very good to be here.
So, Stephen, I wanted to ask you first, before we get into the problem solution that you've brought, a little bit about your heritage. So you're Hungarian ethnically, is that right?
Yes, that's right. So those of a certain age, maybe slightly older than me, would always say to my father, for instance, "Oh, are you related to Lord Balogh?" Now, who was Lord Balogh? Lord Balogh was Lord Thomas Balogh, who was one of Harold Wilson's economic advisors back in the day, in the 1960s, together with Kaldor, another of the terrible Hungarian twins. So many people would say to my father, "Oh, you must be his son or his nephew," because Balogh is, on the face of it, a very uncommon name. People sometimes equate it to Scottish or Irish. But yes, I'm ethnically Hungarian. I was born in London as the son of Hungarian refugees whose children left Hungary after 1956 and the uprising against the Soviets.
And are you related?
So this is the kicker. Balogh is one of the top 10 most common names in Hungary. So possibly along the line, but not directly.
Okay.
I did try to make use of the name when I applied to Oxford for university because he was Master of Balliol, but that didn't quite work, and my destiny has been different.
Okay. And what was it like growing up in the UK with Hungarian parents?
So that's also an interesting one. My parents made the decision, this was 1967 when I was born, that we would be, myself and my two sisters who came along a little later, would be brought up completely British. My parents bought into the fact that Britain had welcomed them in as refugees. My father via France, in fact, a complicated story, but that we should be brought up, as it were, as British as the British. So they actually downplayed some of our ethnic Hungarian side. We didn't mix too much with the expatriate Hungarian community and so on, a little bit. The downside is that my Hungarian is not fully bilingual, and it's a fiendishly difficult language to learn later on, as I'm finding at the moment. But there was no conflict. We were very much brought up to be alongside our peers, leafy Hertfordshire, where we grew up, and then later on. It's only now, really, that I'm discovering a little bit more of my Hungarian roots, but putting it in the context of a really rooted Britishness.
Britishness, but Englishness.
Yes, well, there we are. So that's an interesting one in itself, isn't it? I would say that without diving down that particular rat hole, what's one I'm really, really interested in is particularly given the contemporary debate about, magical soil, magically becoming English or British or something. So I've always described myself as British because I'm a British citizen. I have a British passport. I have a British identity, I believe, but I'm not English. I am British and living in England. That doesn't mean I don't believe very, very deeply in the genius of the English as it's developed over centuries and centuries. But I wouldn't make such a bold claim as to be English because I think that's misplaced.
But that
may be a contentious thing even for our audience. I don't know.
This is partly because of the controversy surrounding some of Konstantin Kissin's comments about Rishi Sunak not being English.
That's right. Yeah, but let's not go down that rabbit hole.
No. It's a very important debate to tease out, I think, and to do it in a sober and reflective way rather than an emotive way.
But today, we don't want to concentrate on that, do we?
What do we want to concentrate on?
Well, I thought, as we were discussing earlier, we'd talk a little bit about transport, the state of transport in this country, particularly the manifest fragmentation and incoherence that's arisen over so many years, actually. And I think it's got worse rather than better. And maybe we could just spend a little bit of time opening up that problem, our own personal experience and our own thoughts about it. I have some of my own. After my economics degree in London and not Oxford, I did a transport master's degree, and I was in the transport sector for 7 years, London Transport. So the countdown electronic bus stop signs that you see, that was my project in the 1990s, of which I feel I'm very justly proud, part of a huge team effort, and it was pioneering in the world. But now it's ubiquitous on your smartphone. I got on the Tramateckles this morning, and it was second nature. So So I've always followed the transport sector, although I've seldom worked in it in the last 30 years.
Do you know, my mum was on the town council when I was younger, and she was the one to sign off the design of the bus stops in our town. And so whenever we would be driving bus to bus stop, she'd say, "That was me. That was me right there." It's probably not quite as impressive, but...
Well, so yes, sadly my wife, who I was married to at the time of my London transport experience, I lost her to cancer, but she would get fed up with me saying, "Well, let's drive this way via some of the bus stops and see if they're actually working." So I think I have some empathy there.
So public transport... does this involve car usage as well? Because this is a wide-ranging topic, right?
Well, I think it's a whole system problem, isn't it? It's a whole system challenge, how to get from A to B. I have a bias towards the railways. I'm from that London transport period, and just in general terms, I'm a really strong advocate of a well-provided, efficient public transport, because I think that is, there's the hackneyed phrase, the arteries of Britain. Whatever the transport links are, if it's slow and inefficient and unreliable, it means that nothing works quite so well as it should. So yes, a whole system problem, railway usage, and let's say car usage. Of course, we could add other modes like air as well, but let's keep it to those.
And in the UK, we're particularly bad at this because, we went to a conference last week that we were telling you about, and they were telling us how in the people that live in big cities in the UK, only 40% of them can get to the city within 30 minutes. Whereas in Europe, it's much, much higher.
Yeah.
And our transport system seems, no matter what transport you use, it seems like it's inefficient or difficult to get around. That's true, I think, when it comes to bicycles or cars or trains. It's kind of a wide-ranging problem, isn't it? So perhaps we can just articulate the problem a little bit and sort of develop that. So where do you think the problem lies with a lot of our transport policy over the last few decades?
Well, goodness, I think it's quite possible to have fundamental disagreements about the root causes. I think one of them would be, and I'm sure William would agree with me, is that there has been a lack of decent town planning.
Yes.
When it comes to urban areas and conurbations in general. I think he comes from a town planning background, doesn't he? And I've had some familiarity with it. So the more anarchically a town or a city is planned and laid out, the less efficient in general is going to be its transport links. But that's not to say that there should be some sort of Stalinist approach to, a sort of top-down dirigist approach to town planning. Every town has to have its character and its genius and its flaws, frankly, which add to its charm and its character. But there hasn't been enough of a guiding hand when it comes to the planning and laying out and organisation generally of towns and cities. And that's one problem. I think there's another problem, which is that when it comes to interurban travel, again, there's been a sort of piecemeal approach, usually as a sort of tinkering of what has gone before. So we end up with a general mishmash of provision and the way in which provision is conceived and arranged. So I think it is. I don't want to jump straight into a simplistic thing. If only it was under complete central control, everything would be fine. And nor do I think it should just be left to the anarchic marketplace. There are cities in South America where all provision of transport is in private hands, and that's maybe in good ways a sort of initiative of somebody with a minibus who just decides to pick up passengers by the side of the road. There are shortfalls there, and there's mass congestion and huge pollution as a result. So it is that sensible guiding hand with a clear remit, I suppose, that I feel has not really been present.
You live in London.
Yes.
And we're here in Manchester, so two big cities of equal importance, I might add.
Well done, Sebastian.
Do you think
definitely?
Do you think that getting around in big cities in the UK is? Do you think there are the same problems when you're travelling within cities as when you're travelling in the countryside or going from city to city?
No, I mean I think, well, I think it depends a little bit. So I am absolutely spoiled in London. It has to be said. Historically, transport provision has been good. I live a 15-minute walk away from the Elizabeth line at Ealing Broadway, which has absolutely transformed travel into the centre of London since it's been put in, and we were already spoiled for choice. Bus usage is not as high as it was historically, but it's still pretty good in London. And because it is centrally planned and laid out, I think it is much more effective. And for more people, it is a native choice. There's a category of user actually in consumer theory anyway, a non-rejecting non-user, someone who doesn't say I really don't want to use it, but never quite gets round to it because there are just little barriers, and I don't know where the bus goes, or I don't know how it's going to feel when I get on it. That in London, that barrier I think is a little bit lower than some other places.
A non-rejecting non-user is someone that's not opposed to it.
Yes.
But doesn't
actually use it.
And there aren't any of those.
So no, I think there are fewer of those in London because it is such a natural thing to do than there are in other places. It gets into contentious things like nudge theory, which is how do we make them not reject anymore, but that's another matter. So I think London is a particular case. It was the only one that was left out of bus deregulation back in the 80s when buses were deregulated in other cities, which I think was an absolute calamity.
Awful.
Absolute calamity.
Can you just
Places like Sheffield.
What that was, the bus
yes, so
deregulation?
under the Conservative administration, following its free market thinking, it had already denationalised the National Bus Company, which I think was actually a good thing at the time. So National Express became a commercial operator. Previously, national coach operations were state-owned. I think that was better in the private sector, and that has been a success. Whereas local bus services were deregulated, which meant that all of the bus companies which had been under state control were sold off, and also and those bus operators had very, very few obligations to run lightly used services. So that led to a huge vacuum, obviously, where bus operators would concentrate on the main corridors, competing. So there were bus wars on the main corridors into Manchester, into Sheffield, into Leeds, leaving people stranded without a bus service or a very sparse bus service elsewhere. So they developed this sort of halfway house, which was the ability of councils to commission bus services. There was a fund for commissioning bus services where they weren't commercially viable, and there would be franchises and contracts let, but the amount of money available for that has got less and less and less over time. So again, it's a little bit of a mishmash in the big cities outside London, and rural areas are very, very sparsely served now, very sadly, which leads to social isolation, social deprivation if you don't have a car.
I don't think it's just rural areas. So certainly a lot of the suburban areas of Manchester, you might have 2 buses in the morning and 2 buses in the afternoon, and that's it. Now, I can understand people not wanting to rely on that as a service to get to work, for example. If even if once a week one of those is cancelled, you're stuck. You can't make it to your destination. So I think often we think about town and rural, and actually it's almost town centre and not town centre, in the same way it's sometimes London and not London for the rest of the country.
Yes, I think I'm in danger of falling into a slightly lazy categorisation. I think you're right. So somebody on the outskirts of a big city might feel just as isolated in transport terms as someone who's out in the wild countryside.
And we're starting to grapple towards some solutions here. You're kind of talking about things being a bit fragmented. What are the solutions to make things work better?
Well, I don't think there are easy solutions. One of the things that I think is generally encouraging has been so on the railways, for instance. I think there is some sort of political consensus and a natural move now towards effective renationalisation of the railway industry. So the railways, as most people will know, were privatised under the Major government in the mid 1990s, with commercial operators issued some short, some long-term contracts to run them commercially, with what became a strategic rail authority, SRA, at the centre. That was the guiding hand, issuing these contracts, doing big upgrade projects like the West Coast Main Line back in the day, and so on. So I personally think that it wasn't entirely the wrong thing to privatise the railways in the mid 1990s. I think it did bring some innovation. It brought some outside capital, which was genuinely useful, and there's arguments over why, but rail ridership did absolutely skyrocket after that period. The extent to which the conditions were already in place under the state-owned railways is, that's a matter of contention. But we got our printer telling us singing in the background. That's okay. But again, it started to get quite fragmented. We all know that the rail track failed. It went bankrupt because it was hubristic and thought it could be a growth stock. The Network Rail came into its place, which was effectively a state-owned company already. And then the Strategic Rail Authority itself was abolished, and all of the functions were brought into the Department for Transport. That has led, to my mind, to the completely illogical situation where a civil servant in the Department for Transport in Whitehall is specifying the thickness of seats on commuter trains in the north of England, or on intercity trains, between London and Doncaster. And I think what's effectively happened is that the decision making has ended up often in the wrong places, and there hasn't really been a single guiding hand. So there's been a realisation of that, I think, universally, and the Conservative government had already started invoking the so-called operator of the last resort to come to the rescue of effectively bankrupt commercial operations like the LNER that took over Northern Rail now. And I think there's a rolling programme that would have happened under the Conservatives, is certainly happening under Labour, to bring everything into public ownership. But that's really just the sort of that's on the one hand the end of the privatisation experiment, but it leaves still a mess. This idea that Grant Shapps had of a great British railways, big fanfare, I think is the right thing in principle. My big question would be, and I think it's always the SDP question going back to first principles, where should the decision making be made? Where would it be best be placed? And I think I would worry a little bit that the way in which this great British Railway Authority will emerge might entrench this decision-making in the wrong places, unless there is a really fresh look to say what the operators can do best, the operators should be allowed to do. What the operator commercial people, the marketing people do best, that should be left to them, and it should be as little as possible left in Whitehall, other than setting the parameters by which it operates. So
I just want to come back slightly to this idea of whether they're in state hands or private sector. If you, I just want to get it back to the basics, because we're having quite a sort of big picture discussion. If you think about, let's say something in the private sector like retail, right? If a shop can't stay in business because it's not doing well enough, it will go out of business. The government doesn't care, because that's how the private, free market works. When a train operator like Northern or others that have been taken into public ownership, when they fail, we have this operator of last resort, like you said. In the debate about what should be in the public sector and what should be in the private sector, I think that's a good marker. If it has to be taken into public hands anyway when it fails, why wasn't it in public hands in the first place?
Oh, yes, I wouldn't quite leap from that question to that as an answer. Within the banking world, which I have some experience, different to Rachel Reeves, banking experience, there's the idea of too big to fail. I think here we've got too important to fail. So I think you'd never let the water companies fail, you'd never let the electricity companies fail. So the basic infrastructure, you'd never let, hospitals fail. But then that leads to certain riders. What happens if it fails? Is there enough slack in the market? Is there enough capacity in the market? Are there enough ready alternatives for people to switch? So if there is a mature, competitive, small c, let's say competitive, not necessarily private market, which can take up the slack, then I think there is healthy competition that can be put into play. But if there's an artificial creation of that healthy competition in the private sector, and actually there's a lot of complication and a lot of expense for the appearance of private enterprise, then I think that's when then it starts to feel as if, what was the point of that? Better in state hands. The benefit of it being in the appearance private sector, under the circumstances, is illusory.
But for the market to work, something has to be able to fail.
Yes.
Right? So I think the banking analogy, I'd say, I don't agree with the concept of too big to fail. Right? Like, if it's too important to fail, then have it in public hands. The state should manage it. That's my take on it.
I'll give you a final chance to answer this, because I think we probably need to move on.
I'm happy to move on after that. No, I wouldn't follow that as a matter of dogma. I wouldn't follow. I think you'd still need to go through the argument as to which market model works best, including in stressed situations, with the absolute backstop that essential services cannot be allowed to fail. But I think there's a much richer debate. I'm not casting you as a sort of one-dimensional character in this. I know you're doing it deliberately, but I would say, without getting too esoteric and too intellectual about it, I think it's worth working through what the right market model is. And what the right market mix is for each given situation. I think one of the big failures, I have to say, and I would say this of government as a whole over the last 20, 30 years, is that it has forgotten how to do stress testing. So when big things do happen, they are a big surprise, where every professional discipline, engineering discipline or financial services discipline these days, good attention is given to what if, how would we deal with it? And for me, actually, I think this is a much bigger question. It would be, let's stress test this to death and then see what the right market model was in the normal course.
Okay.
Sorry, I don't want to be. I just don't want to be simplistic for the sake of it. Of course, yes.
I really appreciate the fact that you take a nuanced view on these things, and we were discussing this beforehand. And I thought it's refreshing to hear somebody talk about these things and say, "Well, it's complex." Because I think everything becomes very one-dimensional, like you were saying, and it can either be you're pro this or you're anti this. So it is important to really delve into it and see the details.
I mean, as a parting shot, maybe on this whole discussion, and one example that I'll throw in, we have a balanced approach to the economy in the SDP. Now, it's very easy to say that, but how then do you describe it? And I think we have the better solutions because we don't start from a position of dogma. Our challenge is then to communicate it in a way that works for people, because I think it's so easy to end up in sort of lazy adages. Our challenge is to take our excellent policies and to communicate them in a way that people say, that's what it means for me in the street. It means that my public services are secure, but it doesn't mean that I am going, that there's going to be necessarily a monopoly supplier that I feel could take me for a ride, sort of thing. Literally in some cases, just because we'll move on to other things. But another huge area is road pricing. We talked about the railways and some of the sort of complexities of the solution there. I think we will need to bite the bullet about how road infrastructure and transport infrastructure and funding is going to be provided and funded. Because there is fragmentation now through increasing EVs, discounts on a road fund license, the fact that petrol duty receipts are going to reduce and so on. and the fact that congestion isn't going away. I was in Eccles last night and watching the sort of crawling on the M62. That needs to be addressed by means, not necessarily just by letting the roads fill up and people sitting there for hours, because that's not good for anyone. So, but that's maybe a debate for another time.
That's great. I think it's a very pragmatic response that you're outlining. On the left, that word pragmatic is used as a real insult. And I've always been quite proud to be called pragmatic.
I think that's good.
And a contentious point on which to end road pricing. If you disagree, email us. I'm
not advocating it necessarily. I just think that we need to bite the bullet on it. And I think the SDP is really well placed with pragmatic thinking to arrive at something that dogmatically other parties might not be able to get to, frankly.
So email in your solutions, our contact details in the show notes.
And that brings us to Culture Club. So let's go to Hilary first.
Okay.
I can see you've got something for Culture Club because you're gripping onto it.
Grasping it, yeah.
So tell us about this book.
So I think I said in one of the early episodes, maybe one or two, that I've been working my way through the books that my mum had left. We lost my mum about 5 years ago now. So I have been looking at all the books that she left and working my way through them. This is one that was presented to her on February the 26th, 1950. So, wow. 75 years ago. So this was presented to her as the first prize for the third females class in the Cleggs Lane Methodist Sunday School. So,
and where was the Cleggs Lane Methodist Sunday School, apart from being on Clegg Lane?
That is in a place called Little Hulton.
Okay.
It's not too far from Eccles, actually, north of Manchester. Anyway, that's an aside. So that's the reason I picked the book up. But it's one of those books that I guess is part of our cultural heritage in some ways, possibly the first English novel. I think there's lots of different contenders to that crown, including Robinson Crusoe. This predates Robinson Crusoe.
Do you know what year it was written?
I knew you were going to ask me that, and no, I don't know. I shall tell you when this was published. This was published in 1947. Oh, and I think it's kind of 1700s, I think.
Okay. Sorry, we just had a light go out on us.
Yeah, we're not quite sure why. It feels like we're down to the emergency generator on the lights front. But let's see. So people probably know about Pilgrim's Progress. So John Bunyan is writing. I think he wrote some of this from prison because he was imprisoned for preaching in a way that didn't meet the required standards of the day, being a bit too evangelistic. And it's a tale of somebody leaving his community and his wife and his family to be a pilgrim. People might know the song, "To Be a Pilgrim."
He who would valiant be. That's
the one. He who would valiant be. Yeah, played at the remembrance service for the late Queen, I think, most recently. Anyway, it's one of those kind of royal occasions, certainly. And it goes through all his all the ways that he had to battle to get to. I'm going to say the promised land. That's probably the wrong phrase. But it's very allegorical. So when you're battling your way through life in an attempt to be a true Christian, it kind of tries to give you allegories about how you might best fight that good fight. And there's what's really interesting, there's loads of things in it that I had no idea came from Pilgrim's Progress. So Vanity Fair is one of the places he ends up.
Uh-huh. Which Thackeray picked up later on.
Exactly, yeah. He was imprisoned there, and his friend at the time was killed there. He goes through the Slough of Despond. Is that how you pronounce it? Slough? Slough? I don't know.
Could be.
Yeah. Where you're really dragged down by both your knowledge of your sin and your experience, and he had to kind of pull himself out of the mire there. Everybody's got kind of odd names, like that. There's people called talkative, and their names are their characteristics. It's that kind of, I suppose, dates it in some ways. But it's got all these lovely little drawings in it, little pictures, and I just so massively enjoyed it. It's a hard read. I think I said to you, Sebastian, didn't I, that sometimes it felt like a little bit of a slog. I was in the slough of despond myself.
Slog of despond.
Trying to get through it. Because it is obviously, very dated in its language, but I would very much recommend it, and it will make the hymn mean more to you when you next sing it.
Did you learn any important lessons from it?
I guess you learn the lesson of recognising that when you set out on a path, it's going to be a challenge, and knowing that you need to always bear in mind that final outcome to get there.
Mm-hmm. Keep your eyes on the prize, basically.
Eyes on the prize.
Very good.
And work out which character you most identify with, I suppose, along the way.
Well, it's interesting because the second half of it is when his wife follows him on the path to be a pilgrim. And clearly, I don't want to be too identity politics about it, but the women's experience is actually quite interesting as well.
Okay, very good. Okay, Stephen, tell us what you've brought to Culture Club.
Well, I thought, given that my Hungarian side was coming up, I thought I would just introduce a little bit of a Hungarian folk song. One of the reasons I do that is that I think in England there's something of a rediscovery of the importance of rootedness and the importance of cultural artefacts like folk singing. We're going to hear a tiny extract in a second, or maybe even in the background, of a Hungarian folk song, which is an old recording from many, many decades ago of someone already old so they're trying to capture, on tape, as it were, these folk songs. But in Hungary, there's been through oppression, through invasion, through occupation and so on, there's been a real holding on to cultural identity through literature, through song, through costume and so on. I think in England, Bella Hardy is a folk singer from Derbyshire who I absolutely love listening to. And there are echoes. It does stir something deep in me from my Hungarian blood, but listening to Bella Hardy evokes for me something of the Derbyshire countryside, and actually she talks of oppression, she talks of hard times, but she talks about hanging together, and in every cultural context some of these things burn through and can help us to this day.
I'll put it in the background a little bit if you,
yes,
do you have anything else to say on it?
Well, only that the title of the song and the first line is I can't remember the Hungarian words, but it translates to "Birdie, birdie, don't splash the water." And it is, on the face of it, just an observation that she's making, maybe watching a bird struggling or something. But it leads into very, very strong lyrical depth about a situation that she's having to go through, and how is it going to be resolved? And how can we do it without splashing the water? So again, very allegorical.
I think this is probably in the Anglosphere. We have a strict sort of, what do you call that? You don't hear much foreign music. I've always thought this was odd, and I've lived in other countries, and I stumble upon music that I absolutely love. I really like Persian music, for example, or Italian, Spanish, French, and you never really hear it in the UK. And it's amazing some of these songs that are even pop songs that are hugely popular in other parts of the world. And I speak to my English friends, and I've never heard of it. there is an interesting treasure chest waiting to be unlocked, I think.
I don't know. I mean, if you go to your local record store, whatever you call a local record store, media store probably these days, there's a massive world music section.
Yeah.
And if you ever listen to Kerry Matthews from Catatonia on the radio, she plays stuff from absolutely everywhere. So,
But singing in English.
No, not at all. I mean, she sings in Welsh, obviously, first language. But I'm not. I'm thinking maybe just you don't necessarily move in the circles.
Have you heard of Maluma?
I don't know them.
Okay, Maluma, for example, I was telling a student about this yesterday. He's one of the biggest selling artists in the world, right? You go to any other country, everybody would know Maluma, but for some reason, nobody does here, right? Just a big selling Colombian artist.
Okay.
Right, but that's kind of my point. It's like hugely popular, billions of views on YouTube.
And let's just turn it the other way around. So one of my favourite bands called The Wedding Present. They are post-punk, I would call them. But they did a whole album of Ukrainian folk songs, you know.
Very good.
That's a great crossover, isn't it?
Yeah, it's
very
absolutely
topical
fabulous.
as well.
I would recommend it.
Well,
We'll put that in the recommendations.
Yeah, there you go.
As well.
So that's a recommendation from us, is go in and explore some Hungarian folk music as well as some other nationalities as well.
And if you haven't heard her on Spotify or wherever, Bella Hardy, just look her up because she speaks to Englishness in a very, very deep way.
Fabulous.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for coming on and talking to us about transport and sharing some of your cultural tastes with us.
It's been a real pleasure. First time in the Manchester office, the HQ, the hub.
That's right.
So I'm really looking forward to going places with this this brilliant sort of initiative and the next stage of the growth of the party as well.
Excellent. Yeah, and I will say, if anybody's been watching the last few episodes, we've sort of progressively changed slightly. So today you'll notice it's a slightly different setup. Do bear with us. We're learning how to deal with the tech. Yeah. So if there's any issues, just give us some time to fix them.
Absolutely. So as always, do subscribe to the channel. Do share the podcast with your friends and family so that we can grow the podcast as we grow the party. Thanks for listening. We will put all the recommendations in the show notes. See you next time.
Okay.
See you next time.
And thank you very much both.